Hello and welcome. In today's lecture, we're going to talk about Caravaggio and the Saint Matthew mysteries. Now, this is something I've taught for many years, whether I'm teaching art history, iconography, which is the study of symbols in art, or my courses in art crime, because this sort of lecture fits in with all of the different categories. This is about approaching paintings and the analysis of them as if they're detective stories. And when I was first studying art history, I was interested in the puzzles, the visual riddles of works of art. The works of art we have to examine, and we need a little bit of a priori knowledge in order to know how to interpret them. But a lot of it is just logic, the way a detective who comes upon a crime scene might examine the evidence before him and try to come up with conclusions. Well, it's the same with works of art, and it's an easy step to see where I got my first interest in analyzing the content of works of art and unpacking those puzzles, approaching it as an art detective, and then continuing and considering the object as a whole, the painting or the sculpture that may have been stolen or may have been involved in a forgery scheme or may have been looted in war or from an illicit antiquities site. And that's the object as the centerpiece of a detective story. And then we also have the content of the object, how to interpret it, and what we can learn from it. And these two come together nicely in the story of Caravaggio's Saint Matthew cycle. Now, first I'm going to give you a little bit of the necessary a priori knowledge. We are probably familiar with Caravaggio's name. You might have a few of his works of art in mind, but we need to know a few things about Caravaggio's life and the sort of things he liked to paint. Caravaggio was the leading artist around 1600 in Rome, and he had a revolutionary technique that no one had ever seen before. His works were more naturalistic, which is another term for realistic, than anyone had ever tried to create beforehand. Through the 15th century in Italy, there was a perpetual movement towards naturalism, making works of art look more like what people saw in real life whenever they opened their eyes and looked out a window. And indeed, the idea that a painting would be illusionistically representative of looking out a framed window, and instead you're looking at a framed work of art, that sort of illusionism was something that 15th century Italian avant-garde artists really enjoyed playing with. Things like single vanishing point perspective and foreshortening, which gave the illusion that a two-dimensional painting was actually a three-dimensional view into another world. Well, Caravaggio took this to a hyper-extension that was never really conceived of by the 15th century artists, and indeed the 16th century artists, the Mannerists, which is the movement that his works emerge from, but are very different from as well. Caravaggio was born in Lombardy in northern Italy, and he began his career in Rome painting as an assistant to someone named Cavaliere d'Arpino, who was a sort of B-level Mannerist painter of not any great repute. And Caravaggio joined his studio as an apprentice and then as an assistant, and he worked on backgrounds, on still lifes and flowers particularly, within the studio. But he never took on Cavaliere d'Arpino's technique, which was called Mannerism. It was emerging from the followers of Michelangelo, the people who thought Michelangelo's art was the greatest that had ever been seen before, and they picked up on it and carried it on, that tradition that began with Michelangelo's painting of the Sistine Chapel ceiling and continued in the second half of his career. Well, Caravaggio did something that was entirely different. He painted works of art that looked as hyper-realistic as possible, and that were also as dramatic as possible. He liked to arrange a very dramatic spotlighting technique, which is called chiaroscuro. Chiaro means clear or light, scuro means dark or obscure in Italian, so it's the play of darkness and light. But prior to Caravaggio, most works of art had a sort of general diffused light. Maybe you can see that the light came from one angle as opposed to another, but it was generally daylight, sunlight all around. Caravaggio did a highly dramatized version of this, and the best way to think of it is perhaps to imagine you're in a dark theater, and then all of a sudden on the stage, a single spotlight shines on a single half of the face of a single actor. That is highly chiaroscuro lighting, and that's what Caravaggio tried to do. He also tried to have a continuum between natural light in the space in which his paintings would hang and the painted light inside them. So we might have an idea that people were emerging from darkness into light, sort of leaning into spotlighting, as opposed to standing on a stage with all of the house lights on, which is what paintings tended to look like before Caravaggio. Caravaggio also painted hyper-realistic, exact portraits of his models. Now, artists have always used models, but they generally used them to position the bodies, and they would airbrush or idealize facial features. And the idea that the model could walk past you on the street and you would recognize them, that didn't really enter into it. There are a few exceptions, but in general, that was avoided. Caravaggio's models appear in many of his paintings, and they are instantly recognizable. And this would cause a problem because many of them were recognizable and unsavory characters who Caravaggio spent time with in a specific neighborhood in Rome circa 1600. Some of them were executioners, jailers, social outcasts, male and female prostitutes. They were the sort of people that Caravaggio enjoyed spending time with. They were his friends, but they were not the sort of people who one would imagine would be featured in very conservative religious artworks. And there's a story that Caravaggio chose as a model for the Virgin Mary for his painting called the Madonna of Loretto. A woman he knew he was friends with named Maria, who happened to be a prostitute. And she would stand on the corner of a street outside the church of San Agostino in Rome. And she would wait for clients. And here's the problem. Caravaggio used her as a model for the Virgin Mary, for the altarpiece for that very church outside of which she would stand and wait for clients. So on Sunday morning, people from the neighborhood would go to church, they'd wave hi, Mary the prostitute, they would go inside and then see her depicted in an absolutely perfect portrait as the Virgin Mary on the altarpiece inside the church. And you can imagine that this didn't go over well with everyone. Caravaggio was looking for trouble. He was a really nasty character. He was extremely violent. He's not the sort of person you would have wanted to hang out with. He beat up people. For instance, a waiter he beat up ostensibly for having served him a plate of overcooked artichokes. He also attacked and mutilated and killed an opponent who was part of a rival gang. We tend to think of street gangs as really badass, but in fact, in 16th century Rome, painters were involved in street gangs and would get into fights with each other, sometimes even kill each other. And this contemporary idea that painters are sort of peace-loving and perhaps a bit effete, that is a very modern notion. And some of the roughest characters were painters in 17th century Rome. Well, Caravaggio got in a fight ostensibly over having lost a game of tennis, but in fact, it was a rival gang member who he attacked, and they were both vying for the affections of the same lover who was a prostitute, and was very messy. And that meant that Caravaggio had to flee Rome. We sometimes have this idea that the past was a lawless time, but in fact that was rarely the case, perhaps in the countryside where laws were more difficult to enforce. But if you murdered someone in Rome circa 1600, you would be arrested and you would be executed. And Caravaggio had to flee for his life. And that's why the end part of his life, for he died very young, he was traveling, he was itinerant, he was doing paintings very quickly in a series of locations, always one step ahead of the law and also one step ahead of gang members who were trying to exact revenge. He would later become one of the Knights of Malta on the island of Rhodes, and he would, being Caravaggio, get into a fight with a fellow knight, be banished from the order, and then members of that order were also chasing him to exact revenge. So he was essentially asking for trouble because of his volatile nature, and he was finding it wherever he went. Very important to keep in mind is that Caravaggio was extremely religious, and he was also hyper-violent. Okay, that sometimes goes hand in hand if we know the history of religion, and in this case it did. He was so religious that he kept to the very specific outlines and demands of the Council of Trent in a way that was considered so modern that it was considered indecorous. It was more than people expected. What was the Council of Trent? Well, the Reformation rose in the middle part of the 16th century when Martin Luther, followed by others, announced that the Catholic Church was a corrupt institution, which at the time it was, and they set about trying to reform Christianity. And some of the things that they objected to was the idea that the Catholic Church tried to control every aspect of your life, birth, marriage, death. They objected to the fact that when you went to church, prior to the 16th century, almost no one in the church would understand almost anything that was said because services were in Latin. Latin was the language of the elite and the educated and the priests. And the local constituents, they wouldn't understand anything. They would probably memorize the sounds of the Latin words in prayer and in hymns and song, but they wouldn't understand the content. The only thing that they would understand was the sermon, which was in the vernacular, the local language, which meant that this was what people would take for the interpretation of the Latin that they hadn't understood. Whatever that priest teaches them about what was read from the Bible that day is what they would understand and take home from it. So all the interpretation of the Bible was therefore controlled by the priests who gave the sermon. There was also the objection to the fact that Catholic art was figurative. And this goes directly against one of the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not create graven images. Catholics decided to interpret this in an alternative way. They decided that you should not create false idols, okay? But Jews and Muslims and Protestants interpreted it in a different way that is probably closer to the core of the 10 Commandments, that you literally cannot make an image that reproduces God in particular, which is why Jewish and Islamic art is very beautiful, but it is not figurative. It tends to be botanical or geometric, whereas Christian art, especially Catholic, is extremely figurative, extremely realistic, and trying to use that to its advantage to try to get the constituents to have a more meditative experience by looking at a work of art and being able to better visualize the moment in the Bible that they are being taught about. Protestants said, no, this is not correct. We only want non-figurative art if it's religious art. So you can have portraits of civilians in Protestant world, but you can't have a picture of God or Jesus. And then you get extremes of this, for instance, in Calvinist churches that are completely whitewashed. There's no art inside that's authentic to when the churches were built, and that's in fact very beautiful and a completely different aesthetic than what we're used to, especially Baroque Catholic churches, which are just art and statues and plaster and porcelain and over the top with extreme decoration. Caravaggio was staying very closely to the outlines laid out in the Council of Trent. The Council of Trent began in 1545 and lasted for several decades. It was a series of emergency meetings on the part of the Catholic Church to figure out what to do about the dangers of the Reformation, because they felt very threatened by it. They were losing millions of faithful, and they were, to be honest, being exposed for the corruption of many members of the clergy. And to decide what to do, they had the Council of Trent and then initiated what was called the Counter-Reformation, which is literally working against the Reformation, the Catholic Church deciding how they are going to react to this very dangerous movement. And one of the things that came out of it was the idea that art should be used in a different way. It had a propagandistic function. You could rally people to your cause if they were moved by works of art that seemed to support or endorse it. But also they felt that figurative art actually helped people, particularly people who weren't so educated and had trouble juggling theories, with the idea that you could look at something and it would help you visualize what it was like at the time. For instance, if you're having trouble understanding how the concept that Christ suffered and died for you, well, if you see a painting of a human who is suffering, it's easier for you to feel a sense of empathy and communion with them. Likewise, if you can't quite imagine what it would be like for the Virgin Mary to know that her infant son was created only in order to be killed to reverse original sin, well, that might be hard for you to grasp. But if you are a parent and you have children that you love and maybe you lost one, and then you see a painting of the Pietà, of Mary mourning over the body of her dead child, then you can sympathize with that and it becomes a more vivid experience. So in short, for the Counter-Reformation, the clergy that were announcing what the Catholic Church and its followers should do, they tried to have art as a way to have a more vivid meditative experience. And there were two ways to do that. One was to have a work of art be made in a contemporary setting even if it's a biblical theme. And this was very new. The idea that you transpose scenes from the Bible to a contemporary setting with contemporary clothing that makes it hit home more easily to the general public. And that was one of the things that Caravaggio latched onto. So the idea that you make it as vivid and emotional and dramatic as possible to appeal to the widest possible public that is not interested in abstract theological theories, well, he took that to a hyper-extended and new realm that was actually too new and avant-garde for the church, the very people that said, this is what you should do, that prescribe how to create art from that point on. Caravaggio also chose a specific moment that he liked to depict in his paintings that was quite new. He liked to pick a moment after an action had begun, but before it had ended. This was very different from what was depicted in the High Renaissance, particularly with art like that of Raphael, where you would have no emotion, no movement. You have the happiest crucifixion scenes you could ever imagine, people just hanging out, having a great time, no tears, no one is upset, and nothing is moving anywhere. And if you imagine that you have a remote control in your hand, and you're going to point it at a painting and press unpause, does any movement happen? Does anything fall? Does anyone start dancing, tip over? Is there any movement at all? In Raphael paintings, the answer is no. People are posed in such a way that it looks a little like a tableau vivant, a scene in which actors are posed and they hold that pose, and you could unpause them all you like and nobody's moving anywhere. If you unpause a Caravaggio, things are flying all over the place. If you look at his Supper at Emmaus paintings, he has a bowl of fruit that is halfway fallen off the table. And another example is in one of the three paintings I want to talk about today, part of the Saint Matthew cycle, and that is Saint Matthew and the Angel. If you look at Saint Matthew and the Angel, you can see that Saint Matthew has been shown at a moment when he's been interrupted in writing his gospel, which would become part of the New Testament. And he's startled. He thought he was alone. He's in a darkened room and he was writing and sitting on a bench. And all of a sudden an angel swoops down and begins enumerating what he should include in that gospel. Now, logically enough, we can imagine that this is something that would freak you out. You think you're all alone and then an angel swoops in and starts talking to you. Caravaggio recognized that and he used that to his advantage. And if you look carefully, and this is a detail that many books that reference this painting fail to acknowledge at all. St. Matthew has been so startled that he has leapt up from the bench on which he's seated, and his knee is on the bench, and he's startled and looking backwards to see the angel. But he was so startled, and his weight has not fully settled, that when he puts his weight back down on the bench will fall forward out of the plane of the painting. You can see a tiny detail that shows you that one of the legs of the bench is actually projecting out, breaking the fourth wall, if you will, coming out of the painting towards our realm as viewers. And it looks like when he puts his weight down fully, that leg will not support it, and the whole bench will flip forward, St. Matthew included. That's a wonderful detail, and this idea that this is paused in the midst of maximum movement with lots of potential energy, to borrow the physics term, and that Matthew is literally in danger of falling out of his own painting. That's a very powerful thing that no one had done before Caravaggio, and Caravaggio liked to play with that. And he did so also in other works in the St. Matthew cycle. The St. Matthew cycle was painted in 1599 for the church of San Luigi de Francese in Rome. This was the French church in Rome. And if you walk into the church, you breathe all of the incense, it gets very dark and cool, and you walk through the doors, and in front of you is the right-hand transept. Then there's the nave covered in gold. There's a Raphael painting in the same church, and you cross to the far left transept and all the way to the front left corner, and there's a chapel there. That was the chapel paid for by the Cornaro family. All the way at the front left of the church is the Contarelli Chapel. And this is where Caravaggio was commissioned to paint the St. Matthew cycle. This was his first big public commission, and this would make his name and be the talk of Rome. When you face the chapel, you turn to your left as you approach the front of the church, and there's a balustrade that blocks your entry. And this is an important point to keep in mind. When you look at pictures of this work of art in this video or in a book or online, you are seeing the paintings in this chapel in a way that no one, aside from the painter, members of the Contarelli family, and clergy, would have ever really been able to see, because the public is not allowed inside the chapel. They look at it from outside the balustrade. That means that they're looking at the paintings from a sharp angle. In the middle, above the altar, is St. Matthew and the angel. On the left-hand side is the calling of St. Matthew. And on the right-hand side is the martyrdom of St. Matthew. And we'll talk about each in turn. But the two paintings on either side are at very sharp 90-degree angles to the balustrade, which means if you look at them, this portion of the painting that is near to you, you see at a sharp angle and is really in your face. And the paintings are so large that the far points are receding from you, and you see them from a sharp angle in the distance, so the figures appear smaller. And what is in your face is highlighted, and what is in the far side recedes. It is anachronistic to view these paintings fully frontal, because almost no one would have ever seen them that way. It's likewise anachronistic to view them with electric lights. That may seem obvious, people didn't have electric lights circa 1600 in Rome, but also keep in mind, when you go to churches in Rome, there's usually a little box next to them. You can put 20 cents in and it turns on a light, and it makes it much easier to see the works of art. But I urge you not to put the coin in, because no one would have ever seen it with electric lights for the first several centuries, and it was certainly never intended to be seen that way. It was intended to be seen with natural light, perhaps coming in through the clerestory window, which is the clear glass window at the top of the chapel that allows some natural light in, and by candle, lamp, or torchlight, and that's it. So when you go into a sort of murky chapel inside a church, it is difficult to see, to pull out details. It appears sort of shadowy, sometimes even a little bit creepy, and that's on purpose. That is something that the artist is aware of, and is often playing with, Caravaggio especially, turning on the overall arching electric lights and viewing these paintings fully frontal is not something that anyone was ever intended to do. So in front of us we have St. Matthew and the angel, and the clerestory window, which is just above this painting, floods light in, and what's an interesting effect that Caravaggio enjoys is trying to match the natural light through the clerestory window and the painted light in the painting. So this illusionism that the natural light and the painted light are unified and you can't quite tell where one ends and the other begins. There is also a ridge, or rather like a platform, that looks like the floor of the space in which St. Matthew has been sitting on a bench and now springs up onto the bench with his knee weighing down on the bench if we were to see him a moment later. And that's very clever because it matches the stone of the altar above which the painting is displayed. And if we imagine unpausing St. Matthew and the angel, he puts his weight on the bench, he tips over forward, out, and rolls down the altar and falls in front of us. It's a very clever, almost inside joke that's probably meant to make us smile. And it's okay to say that some works of art, even serious ones, have a sense of humor in them. People tend to get nervous about saying that, but that is okay to do. Now, when we look to the left and we examine this calling of St. Matthew, we're going to see a number of things that stand out because of the way the painting is positioned that would not stand out in the same way if we look at it the way textbooks tend to show it, which is straight on. The Calling of St. Matthew by Caravaggio was one of the three works in the St. Matthew cycle, painted in 1599, and it shows a moment from not the New Testament, but biblical apocrypha, particularly the Golden Legend, which tells the lives of the saints. It's a group biography of saints, how they lived, in what dramatic and ingeniously gruesome way they were killed in many cases, what they did during their life, what miracles they performed. And it informs most paintings that involve saints. In the Calling of St. Matthew, we see a moment when Jesus encounters Matthew for the first time, before he's been summoned to his side. When Jesus began to travel, the first two people he summoned to go with him, his apostles, were a pair of brothers, St. Peter and St. Andrew. And in this painting, we see Jesus, and he's recognizable. He looks rather Jesus-like. He has a halo, and he's reaching out with his hand like this, indicating, gesturing towards someone. And the big mystery in the calling of St. Matthew is which of the figures gathered around this table is Matthew. And believe it or not, a huge amount of scholarly ink has been spilled over a very specific question involving those figures, whether one finger is bent at the knuckle or straight. But we'll get to that in a moment. Jesus has his arm held out like this, indicating, and it's a sort of funny gesture. You normally point at someone like this, but art historians in the audience may recognize this is a visual reference to the most famous painting in Rome in 1599, painted by another guy whose first name was Michelangelo. Caravaggio's name was Michelangelo Merisi da Caravaggio, and Caravaggio was his nickname. The previous most famous Michelangelo was the Michelangelo Buonarroti, and this hand position is a direct reference to the hand of God in the creation of Adam in the Sistine Chapel. And this is an inside joke that Caravaggio would have enjoyed, saying, hey guys, there's a new Michelangelo in town, and he's making a visual reference to the previous one. St. Peter is with him, and we know it's St. Peter because he's holding a pair of keys. This is St. Peter's hagiographic icon, or the symbol of his sainthood that acts as a sort of name tag, an identifier so we know who is who. Of course, no one knows what these people looked like when they lived. They're generally shown as Caucasian men with beards. They certainly did not look like Caucasian men with beards. They almost certainly looked like Middle Eastern men with beards. But that's another story. Each culture has tended to make Christian figures look like they look in order to feel more of a connection. And in this case, we have this general idea that they're probably wearing togas and have beards, but it's hard to know who's who. Hagiographic icons act as a name tag for viewers who can't read. Occasionally you'll have people's names, St. Peter or Petrus if it's written in Latin, but more often you'll have an object that is associated with their life or sometimes the way they die. So St. Peter is almost always shown with a pair of keys, the keys to heaven that Jesus gave him. St. Peter is considered the first pope, which is why whenever you see the papal coat of arms, regardless of which pope it represents, it shows the papal tiara and the crossed keys of St. Peter to show that it's the papal insignia. You also, for instance, have an X-shaped cross is representative of St. Andrew because he was crucified on an X-shaped cross. And the most famous of all icons, a cross, is the hagiographic icon of Jesus. We even have icons today that are much more mundane. For instance, if you see golden arches, you know that that represents McDonald's. It's the icon that represents the concept of the restaurant and gives you an association with it. This restaurant, if it has this symbol on it, we know it's McDonald's. That's the mundane version that we have today, and this is the sacral version that was passed down from artist to artist and became part of the visual tradition for an audience that was largely illiterate. So we have these two figures, and Jesus is indicating someone, and then next to him, there's a large table that looks like it's maybe in front of a tavern or just inside a tavern. It's very difficult to tell because we have this overall diffused darkness. We have what looks like light shining in from over Jesus' shoulder, and that painted light provides a light that puts the figures around the table in shadow. So behind them, away from the painted light, is much darker than in front of them where the painted light shines. Also, the clerestory window, which is in the upper corner, would have shown natural light in the same trajectory as the painted light, so we have that nice continuum. The figure of Jesus and Peter is very far away from the viewer when you're actually in the chapel, and it looks a little bit like he may be pointing at you. Whereas we have this figure hunched over the table with his back to us, the viewer, when we view the chapel the way it's meant to be from behind the balustrade. That hunched over figure at the end of the table, that figure is someone who appears to be blocking our view of the scene, and we see them very large, as opposed to Jesus, who's in the distance, which is very small. The big question, the million-dollar question, is which of the figures gathered at this table is Matthew prior to being called? Matthew, depending on your translation of the Greek of the New Testament, was either a tax collector or a money lender. In either case, he was someone who was involved with the sin of greed. And there's a theme that the apostles were sinners until they saw the light and began to collaborate with Jesus. And so in either way, we have this group of people involved in taking money and involved in the sin of greed. And they're doling out money at a table. There are a number of figures with their back to the viewer. But one of the things that you'll see immediately is that the figures are not in togas. Jesus and Peter are, but the figures around the table are in contemporary, circa 1599 clothing that you would see around Rome. And this is an important point. This is a hybridization that is really new that Caravaggio pioneered. The idea that you have some figures in contemporary clothing and some figures in biblical. That's part of the idea of the Counter-Reformation, but it was so new, and he was really the first artist to try it, that it was a little too much and considered indecorous by many of the churches that commissioned his work. So which of the figures around the table is St. Matthew? Well, if you close your eyes and look at the painting and then pop them open, your eyes will naturally gravitate towards one figure. That figure is the man with the beard and the hat, who appears to be pointing to himself, looking over at Jesus and saying, "Who, me?" If you look in almost any guidebook, most art history books, or even on the wall copy that you see inside this church, all of them say that this is St. Matthew. And I have always learned, been taught, and teach that that is incorrect. And I'm going to tell you why. But that's the easiest answer. It looks like this is the figure. He's looking up. He's in the middle of the painting. The light is shining most fully on him. Our eyes appear to be drawn to him. If we were to superimpose orthogonal lines or diagonal lines along eye lines where people are looking, lines where people are pointing, and beams of light that we might see in the painting, they seem to converge on this figure. He looks up and he looks over at Jesus, and it looks like he's saying, "Who, me? You're calling me?" But, as I mentioned before, much scholarly ink has been spilt over this one little detail. Is his finger straight or bent at the knuckle? You can probably imagine what the two options mean. If it's straight, then he's pointing to the figure at the end of the table, the one who's hunched over, and he's saying, "Who, him?" If it's bent at the knuckle, he's pointing to himself and he's saying, "Who, me?" Well, to get the masses of tourists on tours through the church quickly as possible, and because, frankly, it's the easiest interpretation, and because art historians and guides tend to teach what they were first taught, and it requires a lot of inertia for us to change our minds, most people interpret it that he is St. Matthew, he has been called, he's about to leave this group of sinners and go off with Jesus. End of story, let's go on to the next site, and that's it. But what I was taught and what I always teach is something that's a good deal more subtle. I believe that this figure with the beard is a red herring. And by red herring, I mean it in the Agatha Christie sense of the term. Someone we're supposed to consider the prime suspect, but who in fact isn't. And Caravaggio is playing with us. He's very playful and enjoys toying with the audience. And in many of his paintings, he has a single figure who we're meant to think is the one we're supposed to focus on, but in fact, he is not. What if his finger is not bent at the knuckle, but is in fact straight? What would that mean? Well, that means he's saying, "Who, him?" and he's expressing surprise that Jesus would call someone who was perhaps even more of a sinner than the man at the table who has recognized and seen Jesus. Who's this man hunched over at the end of the table? Well, the first thing we see is he has no beard. This might not seem that odd, but there is a tradition. If we look at lots of Caravaggio paintings, we get a sense of his modus operandi. And he liked to depict figures looking physically different prior to a spiritual change. So in his painting of the conversion of St. Paul, when St. Paul was a legionnaire named Saul, and he was on the road to Damascus riding a horse, and he saw a blinding light from the sky, and he fell off the horse. He was temporarily blinded, and when his eyesight returned, he had seen the light in a spiritual sense. And later on in his life, he is shown with a beard. Caravaggio shows him beardless. In the two paintings of Supper at Emmaus, that depicts a moment after Jesus has died. He's come back to life, and he's walking along a road, and he encounters someone, Emmaus, who knew him during his life. And for some reason, Emmaus doesn't recognize him. But he invites him, thinking he's a stranger who needs a place to stay and a meal. He invites him to his home for supper and to stay the night. And he only recognizes him as Jesus the moment this stranger gives the blessing over the bread and the wine, which is a Hebrew tradition. And the manner in which he gives the blessing reveals to Emmaus that this is his friend who he thought was dead. And Caravaggio says, okay, why wouldn't he recognize his friend if he had seen him not that long ago? And so he makes him look physically different with no beard. This was very dramatic and revolutionary at the time. That's something that Caravaggio enjoyed doing, was shaking people up and surprising them with his interpretations. But it's something very clever, and it also feeds into our interpretation of this work here. In this work, we have one figure who doesn't look as we might expect him to, and that is this figure hunched over without a beard. And the idea is that maybe he is shown prior to seeing the light, prior to that conversion. But let's zoom in a little bit more. It's a detail that you can hardly see in person, and you can hardly see in digital reproductions of the work of art. But if you really zoom in, you can. This figure is a little bit shady. Looks like he's maybe up to no good. In fact, when we stand at this sharp angle, it looks like his back is to us and he's trying to sort of hide our view of something. And in fact, he's hiding the view from the other people at the table. He is shown by Caravaggio in the process of stealing from his fellow tax collectors. He's doing this in two ways. He has his arms folded over like this, and he's sort of leaning over some coins. And he's pushing one coin into his pocket, hiding the view from the other people at the table with his arm. And his other hand is pushing a coin up his sleeve. You can barely see this in person, but this is the kind of detail that the artist, the commissioners, the Contarelli family, and selected clergy would have enjoyed knowing and pointing out to people who they would bring to visit the painting, that they wouldn't otherwise see it, sort of a hidden treasure, and they can interpret it then and demonstrate how to rationalize the painting and show hidden details that people otherwise wouldn't see. That would give them great pleasure and makes the work of art not something that you just look at and it's beautiful and it has a didactic, moralistic story behind it, but it also has hidden features that is part of a game. And it's okay to say that there are games hidden in these famous works of art, just like it's okay to say that they have a sense of humor. The last thing that gives it away is we understand from past works of art that we've discussed, from other works in the future that Caravaggio painted, if we analyze them, that Caravaggio liked to paint a moment after an action had begun but before it had ended. If the bearded man who's pointing is Saint Matthew, then the action has already ended. Jesus indicates, you come with me. The man looks up, says, who, me? And that's it. But if Jesus indicated, you come with me, the wrong person is noticed. Matthew is so engaged in the sin of greed, of stealing, that he hasn't even noticed that he's been called. That's the more Caravaggesque moment to depict. And for all of these reasons combined, I believe that that man at the end of the table is actually St. Matthew. So St. Matthew mystery number 1 is solved. The final work in the St. Matthew cycle is the Martyrdom of Saint Matthew, and that is on the opposite side from the Calling of Saint Matthew. So when you're standing facing the Contarelli chapel, the balustrades in front of you, directly in front of you above the altar is St. Matthew and the angel. To your left is the Calling of Saint Matthew, and to your right is the Martyrdom of Saint Matthew. And in this case, it's a question like the Kennedy assassination: who is the hidden assassin? And it's more literally a sort of crime scene examination. When I first moved to Slovenia, I learned a little bit about a term I'd never heard before called criminalistics. Criminalistics is something that is taught dating back to the Yugoslav policing system, and it's still taught to this day. And it's a combination of criminology, criminal investigation, forensics, and police procedure. And it's an interesting one because it combines theory with practice in a way that isn't often taught in the West. You have criminologists who have never investigated anyone and never will, who are dealing with the theories, and you have police who know very little about the theories and are not that interested in it. But in criminalistics, you have a combination of the two. And one of the things that they taught was they recognized early on that there is a hypothesis bias that people tend to have, policemen or in everyday life. For instance, if you hear in the news that there is a rape trial, your natural assumption would be that it was a man who attacked a woman. And in most cases that would be correct, but there's a few percentage points of cases where it's not the case. And if you approach it with this bias ahead of time, a priori, there's a danger that you will sway your judgment, because we humans have this natural tendency, unfortunately, to decide ahead of time and to look for information that fuels the decision we already made, feeds it, justifies it, and to ignore information that contradicts what we've already decided in advance. You see this, for example, in politics, where you tend to have news media preaching to the converted. So if you're conservative, you tend to read conservative media, which is going to feed what you already believe and dismiss stuff that seems to contradict what you believe. And if you're in the liberal side, you're going to do the same thing. And it means that we humans are essentially not very open to being demonstrated that there's another option that may be better or more correct. Well, this is dangerous in the case of police investigations. And if anyone's read, To Kill a Mockingbird, you can see the danger of immediately determining that someone is probably guilty. And then you tend to look for evidence that confirms your suspicion and overlook, even if it's at a subconscious level, things that contradict it. Well, criminalistics taught police investigators to enter a crime scene and then immediately come up with multiple possible interpretations, at least 5, and that we're all taking the investigation in different directions. And that is to try to guarantee that you don't pick one probable outcome and then look so hard for evidence to support it that you're blinded to other things and you might accidentally get the wrong person convicted. And then each time a new piece of evidence comes forward, you alter and erase some of the hypotheses about what took place at the crime scene, but replace them with others until at a certain point nothing seems plausible and you can start to shave off ideas and then you come up with one conclusion that must be the logical one. But it's a built-in system that's very clever that tries to teach you to avoid this prejudice a priori that we tend to have, and that can be very dangerous when it's involved in criminal investigations. Well, this is something that we might consider applying to a work of art. It's maybe dangerous to assume that the most obvious person is the prime suspect, and that is perfectly exemplified in Caravaggio's Martyrdom of Saint Matthew. According to the Golden Legend, Saint Matthew was killed, depending on which version of the story you believe or read, in Libya or India. He was preaching the gospel of Jesus, and Christianity was most appealing in its early years to people who had a fairly miserable existence. And it was primarily slaves and women who were the first people who really took to it. And Christianity had a very powerful and clever propagandistic hook. Christianity was perhaps the first religion to say, we know that your life now is horrible, is painful and brutal and full of emotional and physical suffering. But if you are a good person, your next life will be perfect. In heaven, everything's great, there's no pain, everybody's happy. That was very clever because that's postulation that was impossible to definitively contradict. Nobody's died and gone to heaven and can come back and say what it's like. And it also was refreshing in that it acknowledged that life now on earth was not a bed of roses. Many other religions tried to convince people that it's not all that bad now. But this one said, it is bad now, we understand that, but your next life will be perfect. And that appealed to people, of course, initially whose life was not very pleasant. And so the people who were converted by St. Matthew, as we see in this painting, were slaves. He was converting the slaves from a pagan religion of a pagan king. And the pagan king heard about this and didn't like it and sent his soldiers to stop St. Matthew and to kill him. And that's the moment that we see here. On the right-hand side of the painting, we see a number of figures who are in what looks sort of like underwear. They're, for the sake of modesty, wrapped in white sheets, and these were the slaves that were in the midst of being baptized. And you can see that there is a round pool into which they were being submerged in the baptism ritual. We also have people in contemporary costumes, circa 1599 Roman costumes, and these are how Caravaggio depicted the guards sent by the king to kill St. Matthew. And you can see they're armed with swords. St. Matthew himself looks in a sort of timeless, priest-like outfit that might be suitable for biblical times as well. And he's lying on the ground and blood is spurting from a wound. Up in the sky, there's a cloud and there's an angel on it, and the angel is leaning out of the cloud with a palm frond, the frond from a palm tree. And if you're familiar with Catholicism and you've heard of Palm Sunday, a palm is the symbol of martyrdom, that someone was killed for their beliefs. And so if you see a statue of someone with a palm frond in their hand, that means that they were martyred. Well, St. Matthew hasn't quite grabbed the palm frond yet. He's almost there, but he's not quite dead yet, as they would say in Monty Python. As soon as he grabs the palm frond, he's going to be whisked up to heaven by the angel, because the story goes that if you are killed for your beliefs, if you're a martyr, you go directly up to heaven. But he's not quite there yet, he's still alive. And this is a very Caravaggio-esque moment. Raphael would have depicted St. Matthew already dead or already in heaven. But Caravaggio picks a moment after he has received his fatal wound, but before he's actually died. Who is the killer? Well, you can probably see immediately who we're supposed to think is the killer and who most guidebooks and many art history books and even the wall copy in the church will say is the killer. And that's the person who's holding the equivalent of a smoking gun when he's caught red-handed. If you imagine that this is a still from a CCTV camera footage and any policeman in the world saw it, they would say, well, this is obviously the killer. This man is dressed, he looks like a slave. He's got the white sheet wrapped around him, but he's holding a bloody sword. He's grabbed St. Matthew by the wrist violently, and he's screaming in anger. It looks, for all intents and purposes, if you walk in the scene, like he's the killer. He just stabbed St. Matthew, and he's sort of reveling in the fact that he succeeded. But stop. If we learned anything from To Kill a Mockingbird, from 12 Angry Men, from all sorts of criminal investigation trial stories, we know that maybe it isn't all that it seems, and maybe this is also a red herring. What are some of the clues that tell us that this is probably not the killer? Well, first of all, when I told you the story, I said that the king sent his soldiers to kill St. Matthew. And unless one of the soldiers was disguised as a slave, and that's not a component of the story, then that doesn't jive with the way the story was originally told in the Golden Legend. Also, if this slave wearing just a sort of underwear kind of thing was the killer, I don't know where he was hiding the sword that he used to kill St. Matthew. What's another interpretation of the exact same scene, the exact same thing that we come across, but seen from a slightly different angle? Well, one way to interpret it is that the guards came and stabbed St. Matthew and then fled the scene. And this is one of the slaves who was being baptized, who liked St. Matthew, and who picked up the sword that killed him, that has his blood on it, in order to defend him, and has grabbed his wrist to help him up, and is screaming in anger because he's upset that the person he admires and likes has been attacked. It's the exact same scene, viewed from a different mental angle and a very different interpretation. The danger is, if you're not versed in criminalistics as we are now, that this slave would have been arrested and tried and convicted as the murderer, when in fact it doesn't make sense. The exact same scene, interpreted from a slightly different angle, has a very different outcome. Who is the murderer then? Well, one of the things that we know when we look at all of Caravaggio's oeuvre is that he enjoyed depicting himself as the victim of murder or the murderer. And in some cases, he depicted himself as both. In his painting of David with the head of Goliath, He has a portrait of himself as a young man as David, and a portrait of himself as a middle-aged man as the severed head of Goliath. You can imagine Freud has a field day interpreting that. Well, in this case too, there's a self-portrait of Caravaggio as the murderer, and you can barely see him, and it's not easy to spot when we look at the painting full frontally. But when we see it from that sharp angle, from beyond the balustrade, then we see him more clearly because it looks like he's looking back at us. And in fact, he's the bearded figure who is fleeing the crime scene, looking back over his shoulder in order to see if he has fulfilled his duty. And he's the only one of the guards who does not have a sword. All of the others still are carrying their swords. And he, Caravaggio, is shown as the murderer. Now we've interpreted Caravaggio's Saint Matthew cycle, a 3-painting cycle in the Contarelli Chapel in the Church of San Luigi de Francese in Rome. And it's a fascinating series of works of art, one that I think has been largely misinterpreted by most books, guidebooks, and even tour guides, and which gives an introduction to both how we can approach interpreting a single work of art as a puzzle, a mystery, a detective story, a riddle to be solved. And also we can see how it's a logical step to consider the whole work of art as a physical object involved in crime, as another sort of mystery detective story to solve. For instance, when the theft of a different Caravaggio, the Nativity, that was stolen in 1969 from the Church of San Lorenzo in Palermo, Sicily, by Cosa Nostra, and has never been recovered. Then we have this duality that I find fascinating and is the focus of my academic work, which is interpreting works of art that are riddles unto themselves, and then examining mysteries involving theft or forgery with works of art as physical objects. Thank you so much, and join me next time.